In this video, we'll talk about features that are removed or no longer developed as of Windows Server 2025. To start with, the following features are no longer in Windows Server 2025. IIS 6 Management Console. You'd use this console to manage IIS on Windows Server 2003 computers. IIS 10. The version that ships with Windows Server 25 isn't going anywhere, and the console for managing IIS on Windows Server 25 is still fully supported. WordPad has been removed from Windows Server. Notepad is still present and is the enhanced version available in Windows 11. But if you need to edit RTF and doc files on Windows Server, you'll need an alternative to WordPad. The SMTP server feature is removed. Whilst you could configure Windows Server as an SMTP server for the last few decades, most people either had Exchange installed or used a cloud-based email alternative. There are third-party SMTP servers available if you need that functionality, including those available through Windows Subsystem for Linux. Windows PowerShell 2.0 engine is removed. The default version of PowerShell in Windows Server is version 5.1, and you can parallel install version 7.4.5 using winget or the binary files. Now that we've covered what's been taken out of Windows Server 2025, let's talk about the features that are no longer under development, which is sometimes termed deprecated. The important thing to understand is that whilst a feature may no longer be under development or considered deprecated, it doesn't mean that it has been taken out of the operating system. For example, the Wins server role was marked as no longer under development as of Windows Server 2022. Wins has been announced as being on the way out since the early 2000s. And that advice is now old enough to drink in the United States. Wins is still a feature you can install in Windows Server 2025. At some point, a new edition of Windows Server will be released, perhaps Windows Server 2028, and perhaps not, where Wins will no longer be present. But even though it's no longer under development, you'll still be able to install Wins on your Windows Server 2025 computer and have it respond to NetBIOS name resolution requests in 2034. That's because Windows Server 25 will be supported until 2034 and will probably have several years of extended security updates made available after that, pushing support towards 2037. Now to the features no longer under development. The computer browser driver and service are deprecated. The browser protocol and service is a dated and insecure device location protocol. This protocol, service, and driver were first disabled by default in Windows 10 with the removal of the SMB1 service. The failover clustering cluster sets feature is no longer in active feature development and is deprecated. Cluster sets were a new feature introduced in Windows Server 2019 that allow you to group multiple failover clusters together. New routing and remote access deployments in Windows Server 2025 don't accept VPN connections based on PPTP and L2TP protocols by default. However, you can still enable these protocols if necessary. SSTP and IKEv2 based VPN connections are still accepted without any change. If you performed an in-place upgrade of a routing and remote access server and allowed those protocols, they will still be enabled after the upgrade. Network load balancing is no longer in active feature development and is deprecated. Consider using the software load balancer feature for software-defined networking or a hardware device as an alternative. All versions of NTLM, including LANman, NTLM v1, and NTLM v2, are no longer under active feature development and are deprecated. Calls to NTLM should be replaced by calls to negotiate, which will try to authenticate with Kerberos and only fall back to NTLM when necessary. We'll cover how to remove NTLM from your Windows Server and Active Directory environment in a future video. Remote mail slots are deprecated. The remote mail slot protocol, which was initially introduced in MS-DOS, is a dated and simple IPC method that is both unreliable and insecure. TLS versions 1.0 and 1.1 have been deprecated by Internet standards and regulatory bodies due to various security concerns. These versions are disabled by default in Windows Server 2025. The WebDAV redirector service is deprecated and isn't installed by default in Windows Server. The WebDAV redirector is a client-side component in Windows operating systems that enables users to access WebDAV shares as if they were standard network file shares. It allowed you to map a WebDAV server to a drive letter in Windows Explorer. Windows Internal Database is used by several roles, including ADFS, ADRMS, IPAM, RD Connection Broker, and Windows Server Update Services. You should consider using a free or full version of SQL Server for these roles, and it's relatively easy to transition them to do so. Windows Internal Database is present in Server 25, if you need it, but will be removed from Windows in a future release. Beginning with Windows Server 2025, Windows Management Instrumentation command line is available as a feature on demand. You can add it using the dism add capability command. It will be removed from Windows in a future release. Most of what WMIC did in terms of WMI interaction has been replaced over the years by PowerShell functionality. VBScript is available as a feature on demand and pre-installed in Windows Server 25 before its removal from the operating system in a later release. If you still use VBScript as your scripting language, migrate to using PowerShell for automating tasks, custom actions, or scripts. A big one for many people is that Windows Server Update Services is no longer actively developed. As I've mentioned elsewhere, all the existing capabilities and content continue to be available for your deployment, and you can still integrate it with Config and Virtual Machine Manager. It's just that Windows Server Update Services isn't going to be getting any new features or management tools. I've put links to the documentation about deprecation on learn.microsoft.com below. The pages I've linked to there not only cover what's been removed or no longer developed in Server 25, but also Server 2022, Server 2019 and Server 2016. If you want to hear more about Windows Server 25 roles, features, technologies and techniques, click on the playlist on the screen.